always on the second or the first Sunday after Christmas, is the Feast of the Holy Family, where we honor Jesus, Mary, and Joseph as the model of family life, but really also pray for our own families and how important really that truly is. I remember several years ago, probably 25, 30 years ago, there was a letter that Pope John Paul II, now St. John Paul II, wrote to the Christian faithful for the Feast of the Holy Family, in which he called the family the most important unit in society. And what he meant by that, as he explained, is that it is within the family that we learn certain values that are essential to our well-being and our upbringing, but also to our society as a whole. Things like faith, things like compromise, things like forgiveness, things like right judgment, and all these different things that are so important in all human relationships. He also wrote that also, unfortunately, it is within the family unit that we learn such things that can be so destructive to ourselves personally, but also to our society. Things like racism and sexism and prejudice and various things that kids can take on, kind of the persona of what they learn and what they observe and experience when they are very, very young. So the family is the most important unit in society, in a sense kind of raising young people and putting them into the world for relationships in school, in work, and various other aspects of our life. So it's important to pray for families and very strong families. Everyone has a family, and what that looks like is probably different for everyone who is gathered here. And we all have good aspects of our family. We all have some embarrassing aspects of our family, I think, as well. And there are relationships within our family that we're more tied to and closer to, and they change and shift over time. And people are welcomed into families through marriage in various ways. People sometimes exit families sometimes through the pain and the despair of divorce, or even through death, that families kind of ebb and flow, if you will. And so that's part of an aspect of life that is all part of growing up and part of living in a sense. So families are so important that it's important for us to reflect on how our own families and our role and our relationship within families, and what do we contribute and what do we add to them, but also what are we taking away from them? What are we not doing maybe that we should be doing? Family is the most important unit in society. We also honor specifically the Holy Family of Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, and we get this short little reading from the Gospel of Luke. This does not come up very often in our cycle of readings, maybe only once every 3 years or so that we hear this little snippet of Jesus when he is 12 years old. Amazingly, with all the scriptures, with everything, the stories that we have of Jesus, we know very, very little about his young life, his early years. Most of us are pretty familiar with the Christmas story that's depicted often in the creche of Jesus being born, that is told to us in Matthew and Luke's Gospel, the shepherds and the angels and all of those different things. But then outside of really that, except for this little passage that we have today, there's absolutely nothing about the growing up years of Jesus. We know nothing about his very early years. We have this little snippet when he is 12 years old, and then we hear nothing again about him until he begins his public ministry when he is baptized in the Jordan River by John the Baptist when he's about 30 years old. So very, very little is known of his early years. But this particular story tells us a little bit, I think, about what life was like in Jesus' day, and really the role and the central role of family life in Jesus' day as well. It was customary for Jews to make the journey into the city of Jerusalem for the Feast of Passover, always in the spring. And Nazareth was probably about 60 miles or so south of Jerusalem, and Luke says that Mary and Joseph, as was their custom, every year went to Jerusalem for the Feast of Passover. And so they took Jesus with him. So he had been there at different times for this particular feast. Travel in Jesus' day was very difficult. You couldn't get on a plane, you couldn't get on a bus, you couldn't get in a car, you had to walk everywhere. And the roads were not paved, they were just kind of dirt roads, very rocky. Your sense of footwear could be, if you were lucky, you could find a small piece of leather to strap to your feet, but otherwise it would be some sort of material, probably what we would consider to be like cardboard, that you would strap to your feet with the use of maybe some twine or something like that, and you would make your way on that dirty, rocky road. People would not travel alone. They often traveled in, as Luke says, in caravans. Probably hundreds of people as a group would make the journey. Part of that was for mutual support, but also part of it was that you protected yourself from robbers and from those maybe who would attack or try to assault you along the way if you were traveling by yourself or maybe with just a few companions. So as they went to Jerusalem, they celebrated the Feast of Passover. They began to make their way back to Nazareth. And after an entire day of traveling, Mary and Joseph just assume that the boy is with other family members. And that would be a common assumption because everybody sort of took care of each other. And so probably towards the evening when they sat down to the evening meal or sat down to get something to eat, there they noticed when they went to look for Jesus, check in, he's not there. Now, anybody who has a child who has lost their child for even 2 seconds knows the amount of anxiety that brings. So Mary and Joseph have to make their way back to Jerusalem, pretty dangerous if they're going to go by themselves, but also an entire day's journey just to get back to the city, and the kid is still missing. And as they're in the city, it's not 1, it's not 2, but it's 3 days before they actually find him, and in the temple, probably off in some side room that some poor peasants like Mary and Joseph probably would never have entered in the first place. But there he is, sitting in the midst of these elders and these wise people, and they're captivated by what he's saying. You can imagine have the scene of this little 12-year-old boy for 3 days that is teaching these elders, and they're just amazed by his words, Luke says. How could you do this, Mary says. You know, there's a wonderful window at St. Joseph's in Farley that depicts this particular scene, and this kind of Jesus kind of sitting in the midst of these older people, and then Mary and Joseph are off to the side. Mary's face kind of looks like she wants to reach out and swat the baby Jesus because he just disappeared on them. But you can imagine, you know, the kind of almost the anger in Mary and Joseph. How could you do this to us? And Jesus is perplexed, like, well, where else would I be but here in my Father's house? You know, Luke is in a sense kind of giving us a foretaste of what this child who was born into the world is going to be. And ultimately, Jesus is going to be led back to Jerusalem where the crucifixion takes place. So Luke is telling us lots in this story. It's not just of a kid who disappears, it's also in a sense a foretaste of the future of what Jesus' destiny is going to be. But it's a story of family life. And it's a story of how Mary and Joseph loved their son and how they were very concerned for him. And when they found him, they took him home where he grew in wisdom and strength and honor before God and man, as Luke says. Pray for families. This on the Feast of the Holy Family especially. Pray for strength of families because they truly are the most important unit in our society.